Well, look, I'm Beck and I'm sort of going to host our Zoom meeting tonight. I suppose before we officially sort of get started, just a couple of little housekeeping things so we can keep on top of the meeting and as people join. But I'm a member of the SHIRE Salvos, and this is just a thing that we've started recently called SHIRE Connections, and we just sort of tackle different topics as they arise each month. And this one is raising resilient kids. It's going to be recorded, this session, and it will be available afterwards for viewing. We ask that during the presentation, if you can all have your microphones on mute, which are all been model students so far and you're all on mute. Please use the chat to make comments and interact. And of course, any general questions you'd like to ask, you're welcome to ask in there. If it's a question you feel a little bit awkward to ask or shy, you're welcome to private message me, Beck, and I can ask it at the end after Lyn and Julia sort of present their topic and their examples. And at the end, we can have a little bit of a Q&A, which will be great to share together with that. I guess now just to introduce our two sort of guests for tonight, we have Lyn Beasy, and she's been a psychologist for over 20 years and is a member of our church at SHIRE Salvos. She's had a private practice in the Shire for the past 10 years and worked for the Salvation Army for 20 years before that. And we have Julia Hosking joining us as well, also a member of SHIRE Salvos Menai, with her husband and two daughters. And we have Isabel, who is 5.5, and Zoe, who is 2.5. Julia is a writer for the Salvation Army, and she also has a little hobby blog for women called Live the Gift. So I'll hand it over to these guys to kick us off on our topic tonight, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Over to you, Lyn.
Okay, thanks, Beck. Thanks for that introduction. I've only been in private practice 5 years in the Shire, so I just want to clarify that. But yeah, I'm part of a private practice in Caringbah in the Shire. And when we started talking about these Shire connection topics, last month, or probably only about 3 weeks ago, I did a presentation on surviving and thriving through the isolation period in COVID, and we really didn't touch on things about kids, and it seemed as though this was kind of the next step that we wanted to look at. And so I sort of thought, okay, well, let's kick it off with where we're at now, and as well as how we can go forward and learn and teach our kids to be more resilient. And the fact that we've needed to be resilient in these challenging times is a perfect example. And I also invited Julia along because she's a young mum, and Julia and I were chatting one day about this topic, and I know that she reads widely and has got her own girls that she's sort of trial and error, doing things with. And so I thought it would be really great to sort of have her perspective on someone that's actually, got young kids and what that's like. So, Julia's going to add her bits into it as well. So when we sort of think about resilience, sometimes there's lots of different definitions of what resilience is. But basically, you look at resilience as being developing emotional strength to overcome a lot of the obstacles that we have in life. And some people, this sort of is innate and it comes more naturally, and others it just really needs to be sort of built up and developed. But the good news is that these things can be learned, and these are skills that we can all benefit from, not just about helping our kids to be resilient. So as we go through, I'm only going to touch on a few things because it is such a wide topic and there are so many things that we can sort of cover in this space. But yeah, as we go through, I've kind of come up with a few key ideas to look at with, how we can help build that resilience in our kids. It doesn't mean that we're going to be immune from stress when we're resilient. It just means that as stress arises, we have that capacity and ability to cope with pressures and stresses. and able to bounce back from those difficult times. And as we see at the moment, you know, as a society, how we've had this pressure and this stress of being in isolation, and now how we kind of move out of that is going to test our resilience, how quickly and adaptive we can be in this space. It's also helpful to remember that not all stress is harmful. We actually need some stress in our lives. So, you know, one of the things about looking at stress is not to see it as the enemy, but it's just being able to manage and be able to sort of be more resilient, I guess, more adaptive to the stresses that we have. So we can teach our kids that stress isn't all bad and it's not something to be feared, but it's a natural response that's for our, you know, benefit. So I wanted to cover a few ideas that will add to your parenting toolkit that will help develop a child's resilience as well as perhaps building your own. So as I said, I wanted to briefly touch on, you know, where we are in terms of coming out of isolation. And I guess there's still a few weeks of adjustment to have. And as we come out of that isolation and back into regular routines again, this is a current issue that families are talking about and families are facing as we re-enter into, you know, what normal life is again. And certainly for those going back to school, many kids have said that they've enjoyed being home. They've enjoyed, you know, that feeling of being safe at home. Perhaps it's been, you know, an opportunity to avoid the stresses of school, perhaps, you know, the social or bullying aspects of school and other stresses. And so having to then say, right, you've got to go back to school, that can be stressful for some kids. Having said that, there's a lot of kids that you talk to the teachers and the kids have been really busting to go back to school too. So there are both, you know, ends of the spectrum there. Most kids over time will settle back into those routines, but there will be some children that sort of perhaps display some more problematic behaviours. And one of the things that's probably helpful is to identify some of the unique ways that kids will express if they've got stress or anxiety. I know that when I was a child, I used to get anxious about certain situations and I would always have stomach aches. And back then you didn't really know what that was. But this apparently is quite a significant sign for kids when they're anxious, is that they may say that they've got a stomach ache or they've got a headache or saying that they feel sick. So if you see that that's happening more often than not, that might be a sign. Or there may be some changes in their appetite or sleeping patterns or not being able to go to sleep themselves without help. And there can be some other behavioural things like avoiding, you know, or refusing to go to places or people, you know, going to see people, things that they would normally have enjoyed doing. They may withdraw from people. They may seek constant reassurance from the parent, or they might find that they, you know, really easily triggered, really, you know, quickly triggered to be angry or upset or frustrated and overwhelmed over what seems, you know, small matters. So if you're starting to see some of those signs in your children, you know, just explore that a bit further with them to find out, you know, what's going on for them. And it's not just the kids that have had trouble going back to school. This time can be stressful and concerning for families. And I know that parents have been anxious about returning to normal and just sort of hearing, you know, the noise and conversations around the place, that this is what we hear from parents, that, you know, they're concerned about their kids going back into this space. And so I thought, you know, this would be a good opportunity for Julia to jump in and talk about what's been your observations of and your insights into how this season has been for a family and how you're starting to come out of that.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of parents, and for me, there's been a balance in how I've felt about school going back. So in one hand, it was really great for the kids to get back to school and be around their friends. But on the other hand, I was really actually enjoying having less rushed mornings and quieter afternoons. So during the time of lockdown, I was homeschooling a kindergartner and caring for a 2-year-old while juggling 2 days of work in between my husband's full-time role. So it was very chaotic, but it was our pace, and we chose our hours of school based on our work commitments. And now I'm led by the school clock. So, you know, getting up out of bed at a certain time, I need to make sure a nut-free lunchbox is packed. What day of the week is it for her schedule? And with a school pickup at 2:30, the day just flies by. But thankfully, you know, ballet classes, playgroup, swimming lessons haven't come back all at once as well. So it's been a nice, slow re-entry to schedule. In fact, as we were coming out of lockdown, we had one busy weekend with 2 social commitments. And so across the 2 weeks, you know, we kind of were like, oh my gosh, this is so busy. And then the next weekend we had a slower weekend, and that just felt like a really nice balance to try and see people, but also enjoy downtime. And so I think that's something that's really key to hold on to. Another thing I've realised is that routine is really beneficial for kids and adults. And I had a strange sense of routine during our lockdown as work hours changed every week. You know, there'd be mummy homeschooling time and then daddy homeschooling time, and that would be our way of life for 3 days a week. But returning to school routine means that there's a return to routine, and that brings a lot of comfort. So one of the things I've really tried to do over these last few weeks is think about what I've appreciated from the COVID season. So for me, that's been more family time, a greater control over my schedule, and being okay with not having a jam-packed calendar every weekend. So I've kind of seen this as like a minimalism for your calendar. The isolation time has been a decluttering of our lives. And now that we are minimal, we can carefully assess what truly sparks joy and belongs in our lives. When we are asked to do something or go somewhere, it's okay to say no, or to say, I'll get back to you, and decide if the event or request lines up with my values and priorities. And to quote the minimalism expert Ali Kasaza, it's okay to say no, and it's okay to set boundaries in your relationships because it's actually healthy. Boundaries show love to yourself and other people, and it means when you have set aside time for someone, they will receive your full attention. So on one final note on that, God actually created boundaries. He made the sky and he made the water as boundaries for us on earth. It gave us life and it gave us space to breathe. Over to you, Mum.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Julia, for that. That's really interesting, the boundaries. So I guess the message here is go slow. Don't rush back into that, you know, isolation schedule and perhaps, you know, the busyness of life. Just reassess what's appropriate for your family, and maybe maintain some of those family traditions that you've kind of set up. Whether it's be, you know, once a month or something, or a weekly games night, or whatever's appropriate for your family. That I know that parents have really enjoyed some of those things. So try and sort of keep some of those activities scheduled into your time. And as Julia said, manage your boundaries, manage those expectations that you have for yourself and for other people, and watch out for those habits of people pleasing and, you know, the fear of missing out on something if you say no. So managing your child's emotions at this time is really important. And now I guess, you know, we move into, well, how can we build resilience for our kids, and bouncing back through this difficult time, but skills that will certainly be beneficial through our lives, not just for our kids as well. And so I've kind of come up with a couple of points here about how to support your kids to be more resilient. And the first one is about unmelting the meltdown. And this is about emotional regulation. And this can start right back, you know, with your toddlers. We all know about the 2-year-old tantrums that kids have, but I wonder if you know why a tantrum occurs. And it's, you know, there's usually a few reasons why a child will have a tantrum. One is a desire for autonomy, and this is where children are starting to recognise that they're separate from their caregiver or their mother or father or, you know, person. And so they're wanting to exert that independence. Secondly, they haven't developed the language to express what they want. And so they can get easily frustrated with that. And third, they haven't developed what's called a theory of mind, where their feelings are different to everybody else and they can't see other people's points of view. So their emotional regulation is not actually fully developed until middle school years, an 8 or 9 year old. So that, younger children, not just, those typical 2-year-old tantrums, but even younger children, 4, 5, 6 can sometimes have that meltdown as well. And often these meltdowns occur because of one of 5 things, which you think about the acronym HALTS, HALTS, which is, are they hungry? Are they angry? Are they lonely? Are they tired? Or are they stressed? And I think as a parent, you can identify with, some of your own children's behaviours about, is it are they hungry? I need to feed them, or they're tired, or they've been, a really busy day and they just kind of can't cope. So, which is to say that behind every tantrum, there's probably an unmet need. And so it's looking at what's underneath that behaviour, what's driving it. And remembering also that they're sponges too. So if they're in an environment where it's stressful, or you're feeling stressed or anxious, they can pick up on that too. And so that they can sort of be sponges and react accordingly. So here's a few steps that you can put in place to unmelt that meltdown, and you can adopt these steps also with older children as well. And the first one is to stay present. So there is a bit of a debate as to whether time out or time in is appropriate. And I think both are helpful techniques to use. Staying present means just staying with that child while they're distressed, and not, if you're going to use time out, it's not seen as a punishment, but it may be, hey, I'm just going to put you in your room for a couple of minutes and just allow yourself to calm down, and then we're going to talk about this. So it's not seen as go to your room, and as a punishment. So whatever that time out or time is, make it, age appropriate. And if it is a time out, make sure that it's, quite limited according to their age. But this helps the child a chance to just regulate and calm themselves down. So the second one is to use soothing voice and soothing language. So don't you get caught up in the emotional reactivity as well. Let go of any attempts to try and reason with this child in the midst of this meltdown, because even for adults, for all of us, if there is heightened emotion, reason goes out the window, and it's what's called an emotional hijack. So we can't think clearly when we're in this emotional hijack. And so kids can't do it either. So we've really got to wait until they've settled before we can actually talk to them about what's happened. And when they're starting to settle, talk about the feelings and name it. So, you sounded frustrated that you couldn't get that toy. And then finally, see whether you can problem solve to come up with a solution together. So there's kind of the 5 steps of helping you to manage that meltdown and unmelt the meltdown, as I said. Julia, what are some of the things that you've tried with your girls?
Yes, so tantrums are very much part of our reality with a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. So one of the things I've realised that once the tantrum has started, there's really not much that can be done. My kids often don't want to be touched because they're physically releasing their tension, whereas other kids, they do actually want to be held. So I think a lot of it is having the tools to be able to know what to do before and after a tantrum, because once it's in it, there's not a lot that can go on. So when Zoe, who's 2.5, gets upset about something, I often see her whole body just tense up and she freezes. She then decides whether she wants to tantrum right there or run off and cry. And often she will actually run away and lie face down, Disney princess style, for her scream. And in fact, we sometimes watch her as though she's deciding whether or not to tantrum. And if you try to interrupt her process, she will definitely tantrum big. So after a minute of storming or stewing or whatever, Zoe sometimes does come back for a cuddle. So I find that the key is just to be available for her. Depending on the situation and what's caused the tantrum, I'll approach her, just let her know that I'm there for her and offer her a cuddle. And she usually shouts, no, or leave me alone. And, you know, most of the time I'm like, okay, all right, I respect that. Isabel, who is now 5.5, was a bit of a harder 2-year-old. She would kick, scream, and be very physical. And so the situation would just escalate. She never wanted cuddles during the tantrum. And in fact, I remember having to carry her like a football with her body stiff as a board out of shopping centres and out of daycare. So she's, you know, what you might hear people say is a power kid or a don't make me kid, but these are actually our natural born leaders. So when she was a toddler, I was definitely still fumbling my way through parenting. But since then, I've learned a lot more by listening to podcasts like Fresh Start Family, which I've been able to apply to her at this age that she's now and to Zoe. And as a result, I think Zoe is actually a lot better at regulating her emotions than Isabel was at this age. But Zoe is still a bit of a temperamental 2-year-old, so who knows? Regardless, I do find both girls are learning to take calm down time when they're upset. They're both getting better at just removing themselves from each other or from me to do so. So it's all about educating them in calm times, like talking about those strategies after the incident so that in the hard time, I can just say, go have some calm down time, and they know to just get away. And they'll often be screaming at each other saying, leave me alone, I'm trying to have calm down time. In these moments, I find that essential oils have actually been really helpful. I've rarely actually applied it to my tantruming child unless it's just gone on and on, or it's a particularly bad mood with Isabel. But I have watched my sister apply lavender or a lavender blend when her daughter had a big meltdown, and they just would go on for ages. For me, I find it effective to apply some oils that kind of just help center me, like cedarwood or spruce trees. Just those woody fragrances are really good at bringing me back to earth when I'm still seething and angry. And citrus smells like orange or lime in our diffuser can energize the room and just bring about a more positive mood. Like Mum said, prevention is better than a cure. So avoiding those triggers before they escalate is ideal. You know, don't go shopping when your kids are hungry or tired. And if you can detect a potential tantrum and your child is rational, like Isabel, I would often find that preemptive explanations would be helpful. So if she wanted the orange bowl for her breakfast, you know, I could say, you can't have the orange bowl because it's dirty and in the dishwasher, rather than just saying, no, you can't have it. Zoe is a bit less rational and is more emotional. And so I would need to kind of say something like, I know you're sad that you can't have that bowl, but unfortunately it is dirty. And that seems to be a more helpful approach for tapping into the way that she communicates.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Julia. So I guess what we're both saying here is that emotional regulation starts early, and it's a really important factor in helping kids build their resilience. And there's a lot of research, of course, showing that emotional regulation is a significant predictor of resilience, and particularly for adolescent resilience. So we really want to sort of start early with this building these skills of emotional regulation. It's annoying when it's an ER and it's resilience. But developing emotional literacy also is a good start, and the first key in helping emotional intelligence is emotional self-awareness, and also the emotional literacy of learning the emotional words to describe emotional experiences. So encouraging your kids to have that language and avoiding minimizing, shutting down or belittling their emotional experiences. I often see adults at work, in my work, that have had families that have avoided talking about emotions, or have unwritten rules about emotions, or being belittled for expressing their emotions, and so they're kind of suppressed, and it comes out later in maladaptive behaviours, or, you know, that inability to be able to share their emotions. So we really do need to make sure that we're helping kids to have good emotional expression, that emotional language is appropriate, as well as teaching kids how to self-soothe. So as Julia said, you know, the girls are now starting to know that they need some calm down time and what they need to do in that space, which sort of takes me to the next thing about finding ways to help your children to self-soothe. And I've just brought a couple of strategies to mind, and they're more like mindfulness strategies. But one of them is teaching kids how to ground themselves. And if they are feeling really overwhelmed, they're often kind of not aware of themselves in space. And so you can ask them to name some colours, you know, name all the blue things in the room, or how many colours can you see, or name some objects. And so that kind of gets them back into the present and into the here and now. If they're old enough, getting them to count backwards from 10 and just taking a few breaths as they breathe, or getting them to take 10 balloon breaths. So it's like blowing up your belly like it's a balloon. Pretend that you're blowing up a balloon. Or another image is about dropping an anchor. Just, you know, the reminder to say to them, drop an anchor, and they know that that's about planting their feet on the ground and taking a nice few deep breaths as though they've got to steady the ship. And using emotional language and developing that emotional literacy, so either naming the emotion or drawing the emotion or giving different colours to their emotions. And if they're older kids, you know, that movie Inside Out was a great example of all the different emotions that we have. So, you know, making sure that you get to watch that with your kids and talk about the emotions that were presented in that movie. Julia, what are some effective ways that you've used to manage the girls' emotions then?
Yeah, so this isn't actually something I've done yet, but I think it's a really great idea, so I wanted to share it. So I mentioned before the podcast Fresh Start Family. So it's an American podcast about positive parenting, and Wendy Snyder is a Christian, and she's the leader of the Fresh Start Family program, and she speaks about what's called a self-calming toolkit. It's basically a box that parents and children fill up for themselves. So she has, you know, things like joggers to remind her to go for a run, or a candle to burn, a yoga mat or a picture of one or something like that, a Bible, and things that just help her to just say, okay, what can I do in this moment to get me out of my angry mood or my distress or whatever it is, anxiety. And a kid's box might have things like stress balls, a mood journal, Play-Doh, essential oils, or a snack container, thinking about the HALTS acronym from before. So the idea is to pack it during a neutral mood time and remind yourself, your spouse, or your child to get out their self-calming kit and participate in a chosen action that could be either brief or long. So this is something that's really effective for all ages and helps you to remind yourself when you need self-care. So one of these days I will get around to making my self-calming toolkit.
That's really great. That's a really practical strategy. And yeah, so a self-calming, I know a question just popped up then about what's the box called, but you can call it anything you like, but it's, you know, a self-care or self-soothing box, or a calming box, something like that, whatever that is appropriate for your kids to call it. And I know that there are adults that use those as well. So that's a really practical strategy. That's helpful. Thanks, Julia. So the next point I wanted to raise is about for parents to get out of the helicopter. And when I say about get out of the helicopter, we have this term about helicopter parenting where we tend to hover over our kids. And this is about making sure that your own regulated emotions or unregulated emotions are not getting in the way of looking after your kids. And so what happens sometimes is that anxious parents will try to smooth over any issues for their child by rescuing them or fixing all their problems. And this can sometimes happen because parents want to avoid their own discomfort. And the problem with that is that it doesn't teach kids how to regulate their own emotions and how to fix and solve their own problems. once again, I see situations with adults where they haven't learnt to be emotionally independent, and they're still reliant on, you know, even in their 30s, they're still reliant on a parent when something goes wrong for them to fix it for them, because they haven't learnt the skills how to do it for themselves. And so we need to be careful that we're not trying to eliminate every risk in our kids' lives, because overprotecting them doesn't teach them how to solve their own problems. And the other thing is that our stress levels and how we express our stress can influence our kids. So the analogy is around the oxygen mask on an airplane. You know, when you get the safety briefing on a plane and they talk about put your own oxygen mask on first before helping children and other people around you. And this is a great illustration for us to remember that if our own stress levels are high, we're not going to be our best for our kids. We may end up taking that out on our kids. And so it's really important for us to have that self-awareness about our own emotional health and our temperature of our emotions, to see that we're not kind of contributing to the problem. So if you are noticing that your stress levels are rising, then before reacting out of that emotion, take yourself, you know, walk away from the situation or take 10 breaths, and just means that it gives you that kind of circuit breaker and that space in order to respond better instead of reacting out of frustration. So we need to sort of try and manage our own emotions as well as managing our kids, and not trying to, you know, solve all their problems for them. They need to learn how to do that themselves, which goes on to the next point of being a coach. And this means instead of fixing the problem for them, it's about encouraging them to have a go themselves. And this will be an opportunity for them to learn how to do something even if they make mistakes. We need our kids to be able to make mistakes in order to learn from them. So you can give realistic encouragement. You can acknowledge that the task is hard for them, but that you have confidence that they can achieve it. And so it's best here to show or model to them, first of all, the desired behaviour. It might be just, you know, something as simple as learning to tie the shoes. And then gradually you give them more and more of the task until they can complete the whole thing on their own. And this is what's called scaffolding, where you are modelling the behaviour and gradually giving them more and more responsibility until the task or the process is learnt. Another thing we've got to be careful about when we're giving praise for that is that the praise, when it's not specific to the task. For example, if we just say, oh, good girl, or oh, you're a clever boy, the child sort of internalizes that and doesn't realize that that's because they did something and they worked hard to achieve that. So we need to make sure that our praise is specific and that it's attached to the task and the outcome itself. And this is something I've actually noticed Julia doing with her girls, and something that I didn't know when I was parenting, but with the years of learning new ways of doing things, I've seen Julia picking up on this. So can you elaborate on that a bit more, Julia?
Yeah, okay. So Zoe started doing this thing when she was actually taking some medicine, and she would be praising herself, going, I did it, I did it. And so we went, oh, that's really interesting. Let's try and emphasize that a little bit more. So, you know, let's say she was building a ring tower and trying to stack the rings onto the stick. So instead of us saying, good girl, when she completes one ring, a praise of you did it becomes more about her achievement and less about her behavior. And it actually builds up a bit more of an internal sense of worth rather than external motivations. So intrinsic motivation is an excellent skill to teach kids. Imagine if your child went through their entire life just motivated by sticker charts and straight A's. So if anyone's a fan of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, think about Amy or Monica from Friends. They are externally motivated. Someone tells them they're doing a great job and they thrive. But suddenly, a good job goes unrecognized, or they make a mistake and things just crash down. So instead, we should all be internally motivated. You know, I vacuum the floor because I want a clean floor and it gives my family a healthier home, not so I can get a sticker on a chart. I get up at 5 a.m. to do some yoga because it's good for my body and mind, not so I can share it on Instagram and get likes. So teaching your children to tap into internal motivations and their personal values help set them up for life. That's not to say a sticker chart or school grades are bad. My kids love a sticker chart, but I've found that it's really good to set limits on it. So give it a specific goal or purpose. Like if they're older kids, you could say, complete these chores to work towards a family movie night at the end of the month, but also help them find a sense of achievement through other means. So not every action should be tied to an external reward or a praise. So like I said before, I try to say things like, you did it, great writing, when Isabel shows me the words she struggled to write. Or something like, thanks for being a great helper to our family by emptying the dishwasher, is a bit more valuable than just saying, good girl. And it helps her understand the internal benefits to her actions and how they actually contribute to a bigger picture.
That's great, Julia. Yeah, thanks. And I think this is where having a growth mindset is helpful too. A growth mindset is when you see challenges as opportunities to learn something, opportunities to grow, because you can understand that you can improve your abilities by effort. So something may be difficult, for example, maths, but a child will understand that making an effort gives them the opportunity to get better at it and to learn, rather than just, oh, I suck at maths and giving up. Whereas if we have a fixed mindset, we sort of think, well, it is what it is and I can't change it. So instead of focusing on what I can't have or what I can't do, we just need to be focused more on, okay, this is the issue. What can I do in this space? Come up with some problem solving. And if we can use this with our kids, instead of, coming up with a solution for them, is to encourage them to look at, well, what's going on here? What are some ways that we can actually work through this? And giving them that opportunity to be part of that problem solving process, so that they learn that and they integrate that into their everyday. So having that growth mindset, I think, is really important.
Hey, Lynn, just sorry to interrupt you there, but I've had a private question. So this one says, my dad said you don't negotiate with terrorists. So should we still negotiate with our kids?
That's an interesting thing. I think depending on what age the child is, I think, yes, we can negotiate with them. And it depends on what it is about. You don't want to get into arguments with your kids over every issue, because you're only then building your own battles. I always used to say, pick your battles with your kids. Some of the things that aren't worth worrying about, how important is it? I can choose to let that go. But there are also going to be some other things that are probably not negotiable. And so, that's a different story. There's a model that I've seen, and I'll try and sort of imagine, see if you can help. Imagine that you've got two circles and they kind of overlap in the middle. And so on one side you've got decisions that the parents make, and on the other side you have decisions that the kids make. And so things that the kids might make will be, what clothes they're going to wear today. Decisions that the parents might make might be that, depending on the age of the child, it could be bedtime, for example. You're going to bed at 7 o'clock and that's it. And then where those circles overlap, it's about where you can negotiate. So are there some situations that we can negotiate? So as a child gets older, for example, you could move bedtimes into negotiating to say, okay, well, on the weekends you can stay up till 8:30, but school nights, it's still 7 o'clock, and so on. So I think that there are, to answer the question, I think there is room where you can negotiate with your kids. But at the same time, be careful that you don't get caught up in constant battles of having to negotiate everything, because that's going to be exhausting. And then the kids are going to think that they can, put one over on the parents. Is that helpful?
That's good. Thanks, Lyn.
Yeah.
And I guess a follow-up to that is the person has said, is it wise to say because I said so to a teenager though?
Probably not. We could probably get away with that when they're kids, when they're little. Teenagers, the challenge with parenting teenagers, you've got to be one step ahead or two steps ahead of them. And, we're not really talking about teenagers tonight. And I think that we wanted to sort of keep it to preteens and under, because it is such a big topic. And I think, that's warrants for another webinar altogether. So, but yeah, I think because I said so may not go over so well with a teenager. Okay, so just building up some mastery and competence and giving them specific skills is also helpful in being that coach mentality. So if they're having difficulty, say, with shyness, you could sort of help teach them how to build their confidence, how to start a conversation with somebody. And so that kind of takes away some of those situations where there might be more anxiety. So looking at ways that you can coach on the sidelines and building up that mastery and those skills for them. So other two tools just to help with some resilience. One of them, we've already touched on before, is about setting boundaries and having a good routine, because kids really thrive in routine. They like predictability. And so if your life sort of feels a bit chaotic and you can't get into a good routine, perhaps think about some specific strategies that would be helpful in terms of maybe setting up a daily or a weekly schedule, getting a whiteboard or a family calendar where you know where everyone is, or, designing some chores and that kids can be responsible for, and so that they start to feel as though they're, a part of the family, but getting that sense of mastery and self-control. And, you can make games out of that. Like I remember when our kids were little, I'd say to them, right, you've got 2 minutes or you've got 30 seconds. How many things can you pick up in 30 seconds? Ready, set, go. And, there'd be a bit of a game about tidying up the room and whatever. So you can kind of make some fun around it. It doesn't have to be, a battle all the time. Or how, as Julia put a note here about, choosing what song you want to listen to while you're doing some housework or doing their chores, so that they've got a part of the whole process and you're not just kind of dictating, you've got to do this. So engaging and enlisting their support is helpful. And the other thing I wanted to look at was focusing your attention. So where you focus your expectations is important. So look for the good in everyone, in their behaviour, and focus it there. So minimize the negative. We need 5 to 10 positive comments to balance out one negative comment. And so if you're sort of always looking at my kid's lazy, you're always going to look for the bits that are lazy. But if you say my kid's caring, you're going to look for those times when they're caring, and you're going to encourage them to continue to be caring. So it's important to notice where your focus of attention is. And then as a family, you can use gratitude also to focus the attention of the family. So it helps to focus on the good things that have happened. And this is something that you can do around the dinner table or at bedtime, asking everyone, around the table, what's one good thing that happened today, and why was it a good thing? What did you like about that? And that's really helpful as kids go to bed too, because they're thinking about something positive as they're going to sleep. So that's, much nicer than thinking about the negatives of the day. So using gratitude is a great way to focus attention. And then looking at thinking differently about things. So making sure that, the 3 C's of thinking, catch the thoughts that are happening, collect the evidence. Is this true or not true? And challenge that thought if it's not true, so that you don't just kind of believe all the self-talk that can sometimes happen in a negative way. So finally, I want to sort of say, be kind to yourself and your kids. We often hear that also having high self-esteem is essential for resilience. But I also want you to recognise the difference between developing high self-esteem and having self-acceptance. And this is about being kind to yourself. Self-acceptance and self-compassion. Sometimes self-esteem means that we can sometimes be critical of ourselves if we don't meet our expectations. Whereas self-compassion recognises, well, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. I can't do everything. I can't be the best at everything, but I'm still okay as a person. And if we can develop healthy self-acceptance, then we can accept our mistakes. We can accept the failures and see them as an opportunity to learn. So instead of setting our kids up for failure by having really high expectations of them, give them manageable challenges and guide and support them, and not be so focused on the success or the outcome. And be careful of not using blanket language like you can do anything that you want or you can be anything that you want, which can sometimes overly inflate self-esteem or set up unrealistic expectations around achievement. And this can cause problems later on when our teens and when our young adults come across their first setback. So be realistic in your expectations, and also have that healthy level of self-acceptance and being kind to yourself. And that's what I mean when I say about self-compassion, being kind to yourself, that recognize as a parent you're going to make mistakes, but you're doing the best you can, you're learning as you're going, and you're not going to do it perfectly all the time. But think about just what's one tiny thing that I can do that will make tomorrow better. And if this is all that you can do and this is all that you can focus on in this point, just making that small change, because steering a ship in a whole new direction takes, steering at 1 degree at a time. And so making those tiny little adjustments can be enough to, just help build a child's resilience as well as your own. So Beck.
Yes, thank you, Lyn and Julia. It's been so good to hear you guys. So everyone on screen, have a little think if you've got any questions. I've got one that I was thinking of. Julia, you touched on it when you said, kids bounce back sometimes really fast after having a big meltdown, but as the parent, often you haven't, perhaps, something nasty was said, you haven't recovered as well. And I think that's an interesting thing, because obviously you want to help them and teach them how to deal with all these sorts of things. But sometimes you're hurt or you're still in that angry moment. And it can be hard to move forward from that. I suppose, Lyn, do you have any techniques, or you, Julia, that you've used to sort of, bring the calm, even though you're still feeling a bit uptight and anxious about it?
Yeah, so that's where your emotional self-awareness is really important. So recognizing, there's hurt here. I'm hurt by this. Here's pain, here's sadness, here's frustration. Recognizing that emotion and using some of those soothing strategies that we talked about before of, breathing, or the soothing kit, those things that, Julia talked about. And, this isn't fair, and sometimes life isn't fair, and this hurts. But I know that I'm going to be okay, and I'm just going to allow myself to just take some time to soothe this and to, bring about some calming inside of myself. And this is something I teach adults all the time, about self-soothing.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just, it's normally been, if there's been an argument with one of the kids about normally something silly, but maybe they've hit me or kicked at me or something like that. And so I'm getting quite upset about that. the biggest thing is just to get away from the situation and not try to teach in that moment, and just to get away from it and let everyone calm down before trying to come back. You know, sometimes it is just putting your hand over your heart. That's something that the Fresh Start family talks about a lot. It's connecting to your heart and saying, what is this about, and what is the why behind what's going on, and what is the teachable moment in this. But I think it's just really using those techniques that that Mum mentioned about, like grounding yourself and deep breathing and trying to just get through it. And normally I just am like, you know what, just get away from me, because I need to process it, and I need to, if I talk to you right now, I am going to lose it with you. Like Zoe broke something ridiculous. And Isabel was like, look, Mum, look what she did. And I just said, I can't deal with this right now, because if I do, my reaction is not going to be positive and my reaction is not going to be helpful. So we'll talk about it later. So just giving yourself space to deal with it, I think.
Yeah. I've just had a question come through. Do you have any tips on primary school aged kids with low self-esteem, or even young kids who are starting to sort of show those signs of low self-esteem?
Yeah, building their confidence, finding their strengths. What are the things that they can do well, and building on those strengths. So, you know, there's kids are going to have a strength in something, and really building that on that. And so that encouraging language, you know, as we talked about, the coaching part of it, of giving them some opportunities to have some challenges that they can, you know, perhaps strive for and reach it through their efforts, to say, hey, you did that. You know, no one else helped you to do that. You did that yourself. And so that then becomes that intrinsic reward and intrinsic motivation. So it's about recognizing that, you know, we have this capacity to be able to have strengths and build on them. And that's really important.
That's great. Well, any last questions before we finish up for tonight?
I was just going to say, I'll add to that too, because the thought was there and then it disappeared and it's come back again. In terms of the low self-esteem, that last point I talked about, the 3 C's of thinking. So catching the thoughts, because the child with the low self-esteem is going to be saying a lot of negative things about themselves. And so get them to start noticing what it is that the dialogue in their head that they're talking to themselves about, how they're perceiving themselves. So catch that thought. Imagine that it's in a thought bubble or a cloud. Grab it. Look at it. Is this true or not true? Where's the evidence? And this is where a parent might have to help them come up with some alternative evidence, because they might say, I'm no good. Well, what are you good at? And, you know, really kind of balance that out, and then, you know, coming up with a better way of looking at that situation. So I think that that's a skill too that can be adopted when you're looking at, you know, managing and trying to build a better sense of self.
Great. Marty, did you have a question?
Lyn, you talked before about the 2 circles and the decisions that parents can make, the decisions that kids can make, negotiations in the middle. And when your kids are all, say, under the teenage years, and they're kind of all in a similar age and stage, everyone can have this sense of fairness because they feel like they're all getting the same kind of, they're in the same kind of stage. When you get half your kids on one side of the teenage fence and some on the other side, and the younger ones can be trying to push up into the teenage before they're ready, and you're trying to hold them back. How do you, what sort of language would you advise or recommend is good to consider when you're trying to remind the young ones, like they're not ready for that other stuff yet? The older ones are able to do.
Yeah, and maybe it's about getting the older ones to talk to the younger ones about, we couldn't do that. That's not appropriate. We had to wait until we were 12 before we could do that. And in a lot of cases in families, the younger ones tend to get permission to do things at a younger age than the older ones do, and they'll always have a little bit of an argy-bargy about that as they get older. Oh, you blah blah blah, we had to wait till we were 15 before we got a mobile phone, and you've got one at 10, you know. That sort of thing. I think it might depend on the relationship that you have with the kids to start with, and perhaps you've got to draw up those circles for each child about what's appropriate for each child, rather than sort of having it as a family thing. But, you know, if there's an age range of, you know, a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old, there's going to be different things that you'll negotiate, and more responsibilities that, you know, the kids will have the opportunity to make those decisions for themselves at the older age group than they would at the younger.
Thank you.
Perfect. Anyone else before we finish up? I want you to miss the opportunity. And you had a couple of resources that maybe we could share, the Raising Children website and...
Yeah, the Raising Children one is an Australian website that's got lots of good information on it. raisingchildren.net.au, but if you just Google Raising Children, it'll come up. And there's some really, as I said, really helpful information for parents of kids across the ages. So whether you've got a toddler or whether you've got, you know, a 15-year-old, there's all sorts of different resources for each age range. So I would say go and have a look at that. Kids Helpline has also got some good information for kids, but also for the adults, for the parents. And so, you know, they kind of write some of the articles. This is what your kids might be experiencing, and this is how you can, you know, talk to them about it. So that can be another good resource. Also, if positivepsychology.com is a good website for general information about resilience. So if you want to know more about resilience in general, that's a helpful one. Julia, do you want to talk about your 2 recommendations?
Yeah, so my suggestions that I mentioned were, I'm just putting them all into the chat. Fresh Start Family, which is an American podcast, the positive parenting one that I referenced. And the other one, Ali Kazaza, if you're interested in minimalism, but she talks about minimalism for your home, like decluttering kind of stuff, but also minimalism for your life. And she has a program and things like that, but also some free resources, and just talks about how you can help to simplify your life, to live the life that God has created for us, to have an abundant life. So both of them are Christian women, both of them are in America. But yeah, I've found their resources to be really helpful. So I will pop them in the chat as well, so people can have them on hand.
Yeah, okay. And the other resource I was just going to mention too is the Triple P Parenting Program. They do have an online course, and they also run courses out of the Three Bridges Community Centre at Menai and some of the other Three Bridges around Australia. So I think that's a useful thing to do too. It's free or low cost parenting program that's been running for many years. I reckon at least 20 years they've been doing Triple P parenting. So that's a really useful resource to look into.
Well, that's so good. Thank you so much to Lyn and Julia for giving up your time and sharing some of these great nuggets of information with us. It's been really worthwhile, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Our next topic for SHIRE Connections is going to be about being money smart with our financial counsellor, Bernadette, which will be really good. So keep an eye on our Facebook page and website for more information about that. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Beck.
Thanks. You're welcome. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, bye.